Curtiss-Wright R-4360 had 28 cylinders, 4 rows of 7, arranged in a helix around a single crankshaft, 56 spark plugs, 56 bearing surfaces requiring simultaneous lubrication through a temperature gradient that varied by 40 degrees between the front row and the rear. 3,500 horsepower from an air-cooled engine in 1944, a figure that had never been achieved before and has never been achieved since by the same method. It was also the proof that the method had reached its absolute physical limit. Curtiss-Wright spent the next decade refusing to accept what that meant. The company was gone by 1965. By the end of this, you'll understand why the most powerful air-cooled piston engine ever built was not defeated by a better piston engine. It was defeated by a physical law it had spent a decade approaching and a company that mistook reaching the ceiling for owning the room beneath it. Most people assume the R-4360 was made obsolete by the jet engine in the straightforward way that better technology replaces older technology. The jet arrived, the piston engine left, progress moved on. That framing is wrong. The R-4360 reached the absolute thermodynamic limit of its technology category at the exact moment the military stopped needing that category. Those are two different things. One is achievement, the other is timing. Curtiss-Wright confused them. To understand how, you have to understand what air cooling actually is as a physical constraint, and why the R-4360's configuration was not engineering ambition, but engineering necessity. Air cooling dissipates combustion, heat through cylinder fins into passing airflow. The fins are machined into the outside of each cylinder barrel. Thin aluminum ridges that increase the surface area exposed to the airstream without adding prohibitive weight. The principle is simple. The constraint is geometric. Fin area is limited by cylinder size. As cylinder displacement increases, the volume of the combustion chamber, and therefore the heat generated per firing cycle, grows as the cube of the cylinder's dimensions. The fin area available to dissipate that heat grows only as the square. Beyond a specific displacement per cylinder, the heat generated exceeds what any practical fin area can remove into any practical airflow. This is not an engineering problem. It has no engineering solution. It is a surface area to volume relationship, and it is fixed by geometry. The R-4360 reached that boundary. Curtiss-Wright's response to the thermodynamic ceiling was the 4-row helix, 28 cylinders arranged in 4 staggered rows of 7, each row offset rotationally from the one ahead of it, so that the cylinders of each rear row sat in the gaps between the cylinders of the row in front, maximizing the airflow reaching the rearmost cylinders. Each individual cylinder was held at the largest displacement that air cooling could sustain without exceeding the thermal limit. The configuration was not chosen for elegance. It was the only arrangement that could deliver 3,500 horsepower while keeping every cylinder within the boundary physics had drawn. The name corncob came from the visual reality of what 4 staggered rows of 7 cylinders looked like on a single crankcase. The ignition system required 56 spark plugs firing in a sequence precise enough to prevent the harmonic vibration that 28 cylinders on a single crankshaft could produce if their firing intervals drifted by even a small margin. The lubrication system delivered oil simultaneously to 56 bearing surfaces through a temperature gradient that varied by approximately 40 degrees between the front row cylinders, cooled by undisturbed incoming airflow, and the rear row cylinders running in air that had already passed through 3 rows of hot metal. The viscosity window within which oil adequately lubricates without coking onto rear cylinder surfaces is narrow. Ambient temperature variation between sea level takeoff and cruise altitude regularly pushed rear cylinders toward the upper boundary of that window. When the boundary was crossed and oil coked onto a rear cylinder's bearing surfaces, the bearing failed. The engine did not recover from bearing failure. A $50,000 engine became condemned scrap before the next scheduled inspection, not because the design was inadequate, but because operating at the physical limit of a technology means operating without the margin that forgives imprecision. Every system on the R-4360 was exactly as complex as the thermodynamics ceiling required it to be, not more. The complexity was the solution, not a symptom of overreach. Curtiss-Wright's engineers had reached the ceiling of what physics allowed. Their executives had not yet decided what to do about the fact that the ceiling no longer mattered. The B-36 Peacemaker entered Strategic Air Command service in 1948 with 6 R-4360s mounted in pusher configuration across the wing, engines facing rearward, propellers pulling air from behind rather than pushing it from the front, a configuration chosen to reduce aerodynamic interference with the wing's lift surface, 6 engines, intercontinental range, the ability to deliver a nuclear weapon to any point in the Soviet Union from bases in the continental United States and return without refueling. The Air Force needed this capability before jet engines could deliver the range it required. The R-4360 was the reason the B-36 existed as a viable weapon system. It was also the reason maintaining one was unlike maintaining anything else in the USAF inventory. 230 hours. That was the mean time between failures for the R-4360 in early B-36 service. Not 230 hours between scheduled overhauls. 230 hours between unscheduled failures requiring engine removal. A B-36 on a combat mission carried spare magnetos and injector nozzles in the aircraft because the probability of needing them before landing was high enough to make the weight penalty operationally acceptable. Crews developed informal diagnostic protocols, specific exhaust color signatures indicating rear cylinder thermal exceedance, specific vibration signatures indicating ignition timing drift in a particular row, that existed in no technical manual because the men writing the technical manuals had not accumulated enough operational hours to know what to listen for. That knowledge lived in the crews and the depot mechanics, transferred informally between people, and existed nowhere else. The Air Force was simultaneously training jet mechanics. The knowledge required to maintain an R-4360 correctly had no overlap with the knowledge required to maintain a J-47 or AJ-57. They were not different levels of the same skill. They were different disciplines entirely. As jet-powered aircraft entered the inventory in increasing numbers through the early 1950s, the trained population capable of keeping an R-4360 within its thermal and ignition windows was not growing. It was aging. Roy Hurley became president of Curtiss-Wright in 1949. The company's annual revenue from R-4360 production and overhaul contracts was approximately $200 million. The J-67, a jet engine program based on a licensed Bristol Olympus derivative intended to give Curtiss-Wright a competitive product in the military jet market, was in development but underfunded relative to the investment the program required to meet the Air Force's schedule. Hurley's documented position, presented in congressional testimony in 1953, was that existing piston engine contract revenue provided sufficient financial stability to sustain the company through the jet transition period. The J-67 would be ready when it was ready. The R-4360 contracts would bridge the gap. The gap did not hold the shape Hurley's projections had assumed. The Air Force's procurement shift away from piston-engined aircraft accelerated through 1950 and 1951 faster than Curtiss-Wright's planning documents had modeled. The B-52 engine competition went to Pratt & Whitney. The F-100 Super Sabre engine competition went to Pratt & Whitney. The contracts Curtiss-Wright needed to fund the J-67's development at the required pace were awarded to manufacturers who had made the investment earlier and had the product ready when the Air Force needed it. The J-67, delivered 3 years behind schedule with reliability problems that reflected the sustained underfunding, was evaluated and found insufficient. The Air Force declined to place production orders. Curtiss-Wright's congressional testimony in 1953 showed $200 million in annual revenue. By 1955, the last R-4360 production contracts had expired. The J-67 program was canceled by the Air Force in 1959. If you can see the problem forming, you're where Curtiss-Wright's board was in 1953, looking at numbers that still appeared stable, while the ground beneath them had already shifted. The J-67 arrived too late and performed too poorly. The Air Force gave the contracts to General Ronsow, Electric, and Pratt & Whitney. Curtiss-Wright had one product left that anyone wanted. The last order for it expired in 1955. Curtiss-Wright sold its airframe division in 1948. The propeller division followed in stages through the 1950s. The J-67 program was canceled in 1959. By 1965, the company that had built more aircraft engines than any other American manufacturer had no aviation products in its catalog. It manufactured industrial clutches, motion control systems, and nuclear reactor components. The Curtiss-Wright Corporation existed as a legal entity and as a name on a building. The aerospace manufacturer it had been was gone. The mechanics who had kept R-4360s airworthy did not retire in a single visible event. The process was gradual and produced no institutional record of what it consumed. As the B-36 fleet was withdrawn from Strategic Air Command service between 1958 and 1959, the depot facilities that had maintained it closed or converted. The Lockheed Constellation operators, TWA, Air France, Qantas, transitioned to jets through the early 1960s, and as each operator retired, its last Connie, the maintenance contracts sustaining certified R-4360 expertise at those stations, ended with it. The mechanics who held that expertise retired when the work retired. Some passed what they knew to colleagues informally. Most of it went with them. What they carried was not in any manual. The rear cylinder coking signatures, specific carbon deposit patterns indicating oil viscosity that exceeded the thermal window during a particular flight profile, were visible to an experienced eye and invisible to someone reading a specification sheet. The ignition timing drift that developed in the third and fourth rows under sustained high-power operation produced a quality in the engine's note that mechanics who had listened to enough R-436Os could localize to a specific row before any instrumentation confirmed it. The lubrication interval adjustments required for Arctic versus tropical versus temperate operation were documented in general terms and understood in specific terms only by people who had gotten them wrong first and learned what wrong looked like. That knowledge existed in people. The people retired. The knowledge retired with them at exactly the rate the engines left service. Some of it survived. The B-29 Fifi, maintained by the Commemorative Air Force, flies with 4 R-436Os. The surviving airworthy Lockheed Constellations, operated by preservation groups in Europe and the United States, carry the engine in its later variants. The mechanics keeping those engines running assembled their knowledge from the last generation of certified R-4360 technicians, from documentation that captured procedure without capturing judgment, and from years of direct empirical experience, building understanding that no training program currently offers and no institution currently certifies. They are, in the practical sense that matters, the last custodians of a living knowledge base that would otherwise exist only in maintenance logs and parts catalogs. At air shows, a running R-4360 announces itself before it is visible. The firing sequence of 28 cylinders in helix arrangement produces a sound with a specific cadence, not the even beat of a smaller radial, not the turbine note of the jets that replaced it, but something between and distinct from both. People who have heard it identify it without hesitation. There's nothing else that sounds like it. The R-436 didn't lose to a better engine. It lost to the moment it was designed for ending before the company that built it had prepared for what came next. Mastery of a technology is not the same as relevance in the market the technology serves. Curtiss-Wright solved every problem the R-4360 presented: thermal, ignition, lubrication, the four-row helix that was the only structure capable of reaching 3,500 horsepower within physical law. The technical achievement was complete. The company had spent the years of that achievement investing in it rather than in what followed. That gap between solving the problem and reading the room is where Curtiss-Wright's future went. Subscribe if this is your kind of story.